Next, we're going to create a storage pool. Now, a storage pool is merely allocating the area of a disk drive that's going to be used, and in this case we're going to be using all of our disk drives. When we're setting up the storage pool, we'll also be setting up whether it's RAID 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and so on, which is how the drives protect themselves against failure using the RAID technology. Once we have the storage pools created, or storage pool created in this case, the next thing is to create volumes, and volumes are the storage areas that you will be referring to in a lot of your setup of backup and synchronization. The volumes, however, can be not only stored on physical drives and SSD drives, well, not necessarily on the cache, but an SSD drive, but it can also be created or virtually created from a USB external drive. So if you have perhaps a 1, 2, 3 terabyte USB connected drive that's available, that was perhaps part of your original network before you implemented this NAS, you can plug it into the USB port on the side of the NAS, and then it immediately becomes useful for other purposes. So you might want to use that for copying files on and off to take off site. You may feel more comfortable doing your backup to the NAS or to a folder inside the NAS, and then copying those freshly created backups on a daily basis onto this USB drive, and then disconnecting it and taking it to another safe location, so you have multiple copies of your essential information stored in different locations. So there's a multitude of uses for these external USB connected drives, so we'll be going to covering those as we move through. Then there's a virtual JBOD. A virtual JBOD is merely an area of another NAS or device on your network that is allocated to this NAS for use, and it will appear to the users and to all software on this NAS as just a part of the local NAS's storage. They won't be aware that physical virtual volume is somewhere else. It doesn't even have to be in the same office. It can be in a remote location. Another handy tool when you're running out of space and you don't necessarily want to go and put another volume in, or perhaps you've used all bays in your NAS and you need a bit more storage on a short-term basis, this is a very useful facility. Now, the disk volumes that we're going to create have to be sized. We have to consider what we're going to put into these volumes, how much space that will require, and how frequently they're going to be backed up. From a security and access standpoint, we also need to create a profile of the types of user or the roles of users that would have access to this information. So here we see a bit of an example used from a customer system. In this case, there is 5 volumes on this machine, on this NAS, and volume number 1 has other folders on it, but the primary folders of interest are these ones here. On the first volume, there'd be a directory called backup. Now you think, why would I have a directory called backup? Surely I'd be backing up to another machine. There are a number of backup options inside these NASs. Some of them are snapshots, some of them are synchronization, and some of them are just plain old backup. Sometimes you want to back up to another location, but you don't necessarily want to be doing that backup when people are writing to the files or making changes. So perhaps some files might not be backed up during the middle of the day when people are working on them. In other cases, you might want to back it up to at a particular time of the day to alleviate load on the machine, and then trickle feed that backed up file to another remote location. Such as the case as if you were backing up, for example, critical information and then storing it in Amazon Glacier or Google Drive or iCloud or any of the multiple off-site cloud backup facilities. You don't have your internet connection may not be able to handle copying that information across quickly. So you might not do it. You might not be sending the information to those remote locations frequently. So in this case, you would have a folder called backup, and you would take your backups at a convenient time for yourself and then copy it into this backup folder, and from there you would have a second mechanism that's available in the NAS to trickle feed that through to an external backup location and basically release the disk space again. So it becomes, in that second scenario, a bit of a staging area, a sandbox where the information is stored and then forwarded on to another location. But there's also many other reasons why you would be able to use a backup folder. So having a backup folder means that it's essential information, and for example, the users that could have access to that may only be the administrators of your network. Another interesting one is downloads. You have a folder called download, and all of your downloads you should, wherever possible, download into that folder. Now, I'm not talking about downloads you are doing on a PC to a local PC's drive. The NAS has the ability for you to do downloads automatically or offload those downloads, so you don't even need to start up a PC. And there are cases where that's quite useful. So it needs to have its own place to store those back downloads as it's downloading them, and so you have a downloads folder. Another scenario is if you are using a torrent to download music, you don't necessarily want to use the torrent on a PC if you can avoid it, because that means that you have to leave your PC on until the files are completely downloaded, number one. Number two, it might not be just convenient to have the PC on. The PC might be being used for something else and you don't want it slowed down. So for your benefit, the NAS has a torrent download service that you can use and offload and get it to do the downloads for you, and it needs a place to store information, and you would set it up to use that download folder. And then the backup regime would be set appropriate to the type of media. For example, you don't need to back up every file in that downloads directory. You may only need to back up what has been added today, or more importantly, what's finished, because you don't want to back up partially completed downloads. So all of these things are this partitioning of your volumes is just based on common sense, but I guess you need to think through the potential scenarios you're going to strike and then set up a backup structure, a folder structure that matches your environment. Another one here is the multimedia. Now, multimedia will be installed by default during this installation, and it will be allocated to this folder. So put it into volume number 1, as will a directory called public be created for you automatically, and another one called web. And here's some ideas of some sizes. If you, with the download folder, if you allocated 500 megabytes, that probably would be okay, because in most of the cases you'd be, when you finish the download, you may well be copying it out of that folder and putting it into some other folder. So the space is not likely to grow. But multimedia, if you are storing videos, if you copy a Blu-ray DVD, for example, down to your NAS, so that then you can share it with everybody in your home, office, or friends, colleagues, and so on. Blu-ray DVDs copied directly as an FTV it range from anywhere between 15 and 25 terabytes. They're huge, and Sony is bringing out a new DVD standard, and the new OLED TVs are increasing the resolution possible on for display. All of these things are pointing towards these files getting even larger. So 6 terabytes is a good starting point. In this case, this machine has 12 terabytes of storage. That's a very large portion, but of that, it's over half. But we'll be talking about the type of volumes that we're using, and we'll be handling that problem as we go through. Public folder is it's just for your transient and guest users and so on. Web folder, the QNAP NAS installation creates a web folder by default, and by default it puts all your web applications in there: WordPress, Joomla, Drupal, blogs, bulletin boards, anything you select from the application center and install will probably be a web application and probably installed in that directory. So I just looked a moment ago at one of our custom machines, and it was 1.7 terabytes. That's the space used, not the space available. The second volume So I'm suggesting creating a second volume here, and this volume is used with these folders in it. That are the folders to, there's a backup folder for this volume again, and it's got a different name to the one in the prior volume. I'll explain that as I'm going through. It has a containers folder, a Docker folder, and a virtual machine folder. So this virtual machine is where the virtual machines would live and they would run from, and so obviously you don't want to have everybody in the organization having access to these folders, because these are systems that will continue to run, and we don't want people depositing files into these folders that are for other purposes, or deleting files from these folders that could well destroy a whole machine. So there's restricted access to this folder. Production. Another volume called production. I always recommend this when setting up a system. So this volume doesn't have to be huge, but it contains a couple of folders as a starting point, which are used by, perhaps you have machines, perhaps you have numerical control machines or manufacturing machines that need to store project information, drivers, downloads, utility software, anything to do with what you would consider to be production in your business. Set apart a volume there and think about it probably won't need much, probably won't need to be a very large volume, but you probably need to consider it from the point of view of user access. Next volume is the one you're probably most familiar with. A generic PC or LAN volume containing folders that would be mapped to PCs as drive N or drive W or drive G or P or whatever it is. This is again doesn't need to be huge, because we used to think that our local networks stored a lot of information, but in comparison to some of the files that are created by modern software and multimedia, these days they're pretty small. But so 100 gigabytes is probably enough. There's a lot in that 100 gigabyte, however, there'll be thousands of files, because they're all little files, word processing files, Excel files, and the user access to these folders is a topic within itself. You'd need to sit down and work out the folder structure under each of those drives, and then who has access to each of those folders and subsections by department, by user, by role. The final volume is a volume used by surveillance. I'm suggesting a whole volume on its own. It doesn't, again, need to be a huge volume, because you'd be taking information. It's a store and forward. You need a volume to store video footage, CTV footage, and recordings as they're happening real time, and then the synchronization and backup regime has to be different again, because you can't have the video footage on a machine that in the office that, on the unlikely event that there's a burglary, the burglar could just pick up the box and walk away. So those videos, that footage needs to be synchronized immediately as soon as it's recorded. So before the intruder had any opportunity to find your NAS and then pull it down or stop it in some way, the system should be smart enough to take the footage, take the camera, and offload it to another site as soon as it happens. So different backup and syncing regime, as you can imagine. So now we'll look at all this. I'm suggesting we have 5 volumes in the setting up of this machine. One basic systems volume, a virtualization volume. So the systems is the one I described before, web, multimedia, and whatever is used by the QNAP installation when it's doing its installation. Then we have a virtualization where we store our virtual machines and Docker containers, which is volume 2. A production volume, a PC LAN volume, and a surveillance volume. Now these initial sizes down here, I've taken off this sample machine, which gives you an idea. Now this sample machine has 16 terabytes of storage in total. So 6 terabytes, 6 terabyte, 3 terabyte, well, that's 21 terabytes of storage. And so you immediately see we've got a problem here. Whoops, that's not going to work because I've only got 16 terabytes in the machine. And that is actually not a problem, because as we're going through, you'll see that there is a mechanism called thin provisioning, which allows us to create volumes larger than our available storage space. and the thin provisioning won't actually use all the space that you've allocated. So more or less you're telling the system how large this could potentially get, and it will only allocate as much as it needs for the storage that you're actually using. So the real usage of your disk drive grows as on demand, and but the actual maximum is being set when you create the volume in the first place. So what we can see here is that we've set the maximum size of these volumes at 66351, but at this point in time this customer's usage of those volumes isn't anywhere near that. Which brings me to another point. Back in the QTS console, click on that top left hand corner, go to Storage Manager, you may as well maximize it, go to Storage Space, and there's a button there called New Storage Pool. Press that, click on that, which is going to use all my 4 disks. I'm going to set this particular machine up to RAID 10. So what I'm doing now is I'm creating the initial storage pool using the entire contents of all 4 drives, and it's going to be RAID 10, which will give me an estimated capacity of 10.9 terabytes. If I was to use RAID 5, I would get 16 terabytes. So you may be asking yourself, well, why would I use RAID 10 if I'm going to lose almost 6 to 5 point something terabytes of storage? The difference is plenty of information that you can find if you look online, but in short, RAID 5 is not an ideal solution for business environments. You're better off using something a bit more robust like RAID 10. There's a number of technical reasons for that, and there's a number of reasons that are based on research and height and probability. I won't go into that at the moment, but in short, when setting up business systems, I would usually use a RAID 10. If it was an infrequently used system for a home, then there was an effective backup regime in place. RAID 5 is quite good. It's quite okay. So, but in this case, it's RAID 10. So we'll proceed with that. You'll notice now the next question is to do with snapshot protection. Snapshotting is a really great tool. I will again explain that in a little bit more detail when we get to that part of the setting up a backup and synchronization. But the short story is snapshotting allows you to take copies of an entire area or entire volume and then restore to the exact same point. It may sound on the surface to be exactly the same as backup and synchronization, but it isn't. It's quite unique and very beneficial in certain scenarios. So we'll come to that as we're moving through. The system's suggesting I allocate 20% as snapshot storage base. So that will give me an allocated space of 8.5 terabytes. I can reduce this later if I'm finding I'm not using it, so I'll just continue with the recommended settings. It's telling me the information on these drives will be erased, which is fine because there's nothing on them. Now this part of the process takes a few minutes, so I'll just pause the video while that's running. So now my storage pool is created. The next thing I'm going to do is create a new volume. Now, if I created a static volume, it's going to use the space and then you can't change it. If I create a thick volume, it gives me slightly better performance, but I'm stuck with each volume. I must allocate a certain amount of space to each volume and I can't change it. So I'm going to use thin multiple volume, and it asks me which storage pool I'm intending to create this in. Now, I might have another storage pool if, for example, I run out of space with this NAS and then decide that I need to attach another NAS box to it. And these are called extension boxes, and you can attach a number of these, and these extension boxes can be 6, 8, 12, even larger in a number of drives inside them. So there's a fair amount of expansion that you can use with these NAS devices. But in this case, I only have one storage pool because I just have the drives that are in the main NAS. So there's just the one to select from. I press next. It's now the point where I must make my decision on how large this volume is to be. And if you remember the slides I showed you just a moment ago, the first volume in this machine, which I was using as an example, was 6 terabytes. Now, as I said, the machine that I was using as an example had I think 16 terabytes of usable space, whereas this one has 8. So we have a different situation here. It might be worthwhile us just shooting back to the files in this sample system and looking at the typical usage, and then coming up with a size for volume 1 which is a little less than 6 terabytes. The multimedia storage currently being used in this machine is 3 terabytes. The public is 600. The download is 500. You could probably knock that down to 200. But in either case, that's about a terabyte between them. And then web on this machine is 1.7 terabytes, which is quite large for the web folder, but probably not that atypical. The web folder could perhaps, in this particular NAS, be dropped by half, to let's say 1 terabyte. There's the multimedia by cut in half as well. So let's start off with an allocation of 3 terabytes all up for this volume. So we'll have 3 terabytes. I'll let threshold 80%. That means it will start beeping and sending you messages. At that, when it gets to 80% of 3 terabytes, finish. And that's about as easy as it is. Now that you've made that decision, that data volume now 1 is now being prepared, and once it's prepared, we should be able to see it on the local network and start copying files to it. I just paused the video momentarily while it was initializing and the systems, which was the message there. It's now started to count down at 52%, now just jumped to 65, doing optimization. So I'll pause the video again and let that continue. You may notice that it says 2.95 terabytes and not 3 terabytes as I entered. That's because it has to round it up or down to match the block size of the device, and if it does bring it down as it has done here, that's perfectly normal. So now it's finished and that volume is created. I might just open that volume up momentarily using manage. Rename, and instead of calling it data volume 1, I might, just for my own benefit, call it volume 1, and then give it a name that means something to me. In my allocation, I call this systems because it was containing a variety of files used by the system itself. So let's call it systems. Notice that it doesn't allow you to put spaces in there. Press apply and close. So before we go on and create the other volumes, let's just have a quick look at this device. We open up a Windows Explorer. We can see that if we look at the local network, there it is. There is a device there called NASOC, some convoluted name, which is the default name allocated by the installation. We're going to give the machine a better name in a minute, but if we just put in / and then that name, you can see the download folder, the home, multimedia, and public folder and web folders created by the default installation. So when it was creating this volume, the first volume, you saw it creating systems. It was undoubtedly copying information into these folders and setting up that volume for the very first time. If we go into any one of these volumes, it's going to ask us to log in. At this point we haven't set up users, so we'll just use the administrator, and we can see information, well, no information as yet in any of those folders. Some files that are on the machine at this moment, and I'm sure if I was just to use this and create a hello text document here just to satisfy your curiosity, and then go over to the file station, the NAS has its own version of File Explorer. Under the multimedia folder, there I have my hello text folder that I've just created, file that I've just created. So that's all working fine. We now can proceed to create the remaining volumes. In our table from before, we saw that volume number 2 in this case is going to be for virtualization. So we're just going to call it VM for virtual machines, and it's 6 terabyte in the sample machine we looked at, but we may again knock that down to 3 terabytes. Production is going to be, in this particular case, way too large at 3 terabytes. 1 terabyte would be sufficient. So PC LAN, that's where the majority of the files are going to be kept, so we need to try and create as much space for that. So my choices are 3 for that, 2 for the second volume, 1 for the third, 3 for the local network, and which is probably way too much, and 1. In fact, I might even knock the local network down, because the volume management tool has a mechanism to allow us to select a volume and expand it. So even if we made a choice that was, and we saw that the volume was filling up too quickly, we could quite easily increase the storage of any one of those volumes. And it's for this reason that when setting up a device like this, we have a maximum available of 10.9. I'd be inclined to not use all of that and leave a little bit in reserve if I needed to, so that I am alerted to the early consumption of volumes prior to, I'm alerted earlier to the consumption of volumes, and can make choices as to which ones I eventually increase the size of, which is proportional to how the business is actually using it, not necessarily what you're trying to guess at this early stage when you're setting the system up for the first time. However, in this case, we have these basic volumes that we've discussed here, and they add up to 10 terabytes, which is okay as well, because in this case we'll allocate the sizes as on this table here, and if we need any extra space, we can always add other additional volumes or additional disk drives or virtual volumes. So proceeding with that, create new volume, thin, two terabytes, 80% threshold. The name is volume 2 for the virtual machines. Finish. That will be ready in a moment. While it's doing it, I'll create volume 3, production. One terabyte. you go, I've got to wait. So I'll wait. And that's finished. And now to the next volume, which is 1 terabyte for production. Just pause while that's completing. And now volume 4, which is the PC LAN network at 3 terabytes. Just call that LAN. And now a volume for surveillance, which at this moment is 1 terabyte as well. When your machine is in use, I'll just explain this while it's preparing that last volume. The dashboard icon in the top right hand corner pops out this screen, which is extremely useful. It not only tells me who is actually logged on at this moment in time, but also some of the recent utilities or installs or upgrades that have been run. Now this machine has 4 networking cards, and when we get into networking, I'll be talking about configuring those, but it's quite useful at times when you're wondering why something is taking so long, or or wondering which network the traffic is being used on the most, to be able to switch between networks and just see what the current activity is. It's also giving me an indication of the heat of the system fan, because that just is an indication of the health. And another facility I use quite frequently is the amount of CPU and RAM that's being used at any one point in time. And of course, my volumes. So with this complete, the volumes are ready to be used. It's now time to start the next phase of the implementation, installing software, utilities and services.